Good evening or good afternoon, wherever you are. Tonight, we're changing the format a little bit. Usually it's Israel Insider, but we thought as it's tonight, exactly 30 years ago, was the famous signing on the White House lawn of the Oslo Accords. We are very excited to have the president of the Middle East Forum, Daniel Pipes, speak on the subject of the Oslo Accords and the lessons learned. In a second, I'll go through a very brief bio of Daniel Pipes, but just for those who don't know this format, Daniel will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to open it for question and answer. So if you have any questions, even during the presentation, please pop them in the Q&A or chat box, and we'll get to them, or as many as we can, straight afterwards. So a quick bio, and then Daniel will have the floor. Daniel Pipes is a historian. He has led the Middle East Forum since its founding in 1994. He has taught at Chicago, Harvard, Pepperdine, and the U.S. Naval War College. He has served in 5 U.S. administrations and has written 16 books, with, I believe, some more to come. He received both his A.B. and Ph.D. from Harvard. And with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ashley, and good afternoon, good evening. The Oslo Accords were, along with the Israel's War of Independence in 1948-49 and the Six-Day War of 1967, a critical event in Israel's history. They began a new era, the era we still live in. Now, what I'm going to do is be partially negative, as you would expect from someone with my perspective, but I'm also going to be surprisingly positive. I think the lessons learned that I put in the title have mostly, the lessons that should have been learned were mostly learned. To review, 30 years ago today, on a beautiful morning, just like this morning, in late summer, there was a glamorous event on the White House lawn with Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and longtime Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. They shook hands, what came to be known as the handshake, with capital T and capital H. And it signed an agreement generally known as the Oslo Accords in tribute to the city where the negotiations were held. Formerly known as the Declaration of Principles on Interim Self-Government Arrangements, it laid the basis for the two parties' mutual recognition and the end of hostilities, each committed to what the other most wanted: recognition and security for Israelis, dignity and autonomy for the Palestinians. In particular, Arafat not only formally recognized Israel, quote, "The PLO recognizes the right of the state of Israel to exist in peace and security," unquote, but he spoke movingly of this occasion, quote, "Our two peoples are awaiting today this historic hope, and they want to give peace a real chance," unquote. Other than a small band of skeptics, myself included, the world saw the Oslo Accords as a brilliant solution. President Bill Clinton, who hosted the event, lauded it as a great occasion of history and hope. Secretary of State ruminated on how the impossible is within our reach. Arafat called it a historic event, inaugurating a new epoch. Shimon Peres, Foreign Minister of Israel, discerned in it the outline of peace in the Middle East. Among many tributes and accolades, Arafat, Rabin, and Peres jointly won the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, those optimistic statements turned out to be wrong. The small band of skeptics was right. The Accords were expected to lead to calm and reconciliation. In fact, they had the opposite effect, spawning more violence and more toxic attitudes. In the long history of diplomacy, has another victorious power ever turned over 2 contiguous territories to a fanatic, murderous, and unbound enemy? I like to call the Oslo Accords Israel's Nakba. Nakba being Arabic for catastrophe, the word used for 1948. What went wrong? Well, Yasser Arafat and the other Palestinians bear full moral responsibility for the failure of the Oslo Accords. They saw it as a tactic to strengthen themselves at a time of crisis. The foreigners were ignorant of history, wrong in their assumptions, immoral in their pursuit of agreement, overconfident in their abilities, and just made endless mistakes. But the really interesting party, to my mind, is the Israeli one. While morally virtuous, they sought peace. The Israeli side made a bewildering array of mistakes that beg for close analysis. I find that they fall into three broad categories. One, a shift in strategic thinking. Two, misunderstanding of the Palestinians. And three, very poor negotiating tactics. I'd like to outline for you 12 such mistakes, and I'll do it briefly, about a minute apiece. In the first place, given the changes in the world, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the defeat of Saddam Hussein, the Israelis indulged in a denigration of military power. Military power isn't so important. This was the zeitgeist. This is what people were saying at the time. Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister, spoke mystically about security not only residing in tanks, airplanes, and ships, but even more so in, quote, the human being, the Israeli citizen, his education, his home, his school, his street, his neighborhood, the society in which he grows, unquote. So military power just wasn't that important at this point in the view of Israel. Secondly, there was this severe reluctance to take casualties. Rabin himself limited some IDF, some Israel Defense Force activities at the expense of achieving military goals. Others in his government were more extreme. His communications minister, Shulamit Aloni, wanted Israel to stop policing the West Bank and Gaza. Another member of the ruling party, Uzi Baram, said that Israeli soldiers going into Palestinian areas should not have rifles. They didn't want violence, didn't want casualties. Then they got the Palestinians wrong. They made areas concerning the PA's dictatorial rule and its radicalism. So my third criticism is about unelected rulers, leaders. The Israelis naively assumed that an unelected leader represented and brought along his population. In fact, on signing the Oslo Accords, Arafat faced massive opposition from his own constituency. Islamists, who predominated in Gaza, radical leftist organizations based in Damascus, and powerful rebellious elements within his own group. So he didn't bring them along. He signed this on his own. Fourth criticism, Palestinian radicalism. Palestinian leaders in 1993 and previously displayed a self-acknowledged and highly visible radicalism, one verging on the anti-rational. Palestinians thrilled to the soaring rhetoric and brutal vision of leaders like Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser and Iraq's Saddam Hussein. When you believe in what you're doing, you don't think about the consequences, is a quote from one Palestinian activist. A member of the Palestine National Council, Asad Abdurrahman, put the matter even more explicitly. We Palestinians are desperate. We are not in the mood for rational discussion. It truly beggars the imagination that responsible, serious, experienced Israelis ignored such warning signs. My third area of criticism, and the bulk of the criticism, has to do with poor negotiating tactics. The Israelis made a litany of mistakes, some of them unbelievable. So my fifth criticism has to do with being too buddy-buddy. Those Israelis who personally negotiated with the Palestinian leaders came to respect them. It came to be known as the Oslo Israelis, broke bed, and discovered that the PA representatives were civilized, even sophisticated as dinner companions. And these Israelis no longer saw them as the enemy, but as partners for peace, completely serious about accepting Israel. There's one example. When he was president as late as 2013, Shimon Peres addressed the PA leader, Mahmoud Abbas, as my dear friend, adding, President Abbas, you are our partner and we are yours. You share our hopes and efforts for peace, and we share yours. You mentioned 2013. So much had happened. And still, the Oslo Israelis just became friends, buddies. Sixth criticism, painful concessions. This is a very interesting thing. One prime minister after another of Israel has articulated a masochistic eagerness to make painful concessions, which really means unilateral surrenders. Shimon Peres, Israel recognizes the Palestinian right to an independent state and is prepared to make painful concessions to make that happen. Ehud Barak, Israel must be prepared to make painful concessions for peace. Ariel Sharon, I am ready to make painful concessions for peace. Ehud Olmert, Israel's prepared to make far-reaching compromises and very painful concessions. And even Benjamin Netanyahu. My predecessors were prepared to make painful concessions, so am I. Who does this? Where in the history of diplomacy have 5 leaders of a powerful state say we're ready to make painful concessions, i.e. unilateral surrender? 7th criticism, even more astonishing than painful concessions, is the open, brazen, bizarre willingness to display vulnerability, a signaled weakness. Israeli leaders openly, even proudly, sent out moans of fatigue, discouragement, and feebleness. There were many of these. Let me read you the most astonishing. It came in 2005 from the Vice Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, a former hardliner, by the way. And he said the following: "We are tired of fighting. We are tired of being courageous. We are tired of winning. We are tired of defeating our enemies. We want that we can be able to live in an entirely different environment of relations with our enemies." Who does this? Yet more bizarre is what I call magical thinking. The Israeli flattery, this is point 8, of the Palestinians became a parody of itself. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin actually stated in a formal speech, a quote, "The Palestinians were not in the past and are not today a threat to the existence of the state of Israel." I like that. Olmert predicted that once the Palestinians become for Israel friends, partners, good neighbors, then the Middle East will indeed become what it was destined to be from the outset, a paradise for all of the world. Also, Olmert made the astonishing declaration, get this, peace is achieved through concessions. We all know that. Think of World War II. 9th point, the Israelis overestimated the importance of documents. Rabin, Peres, and the others assumed that if you got a signature on an official document, that means everything changed. When Arafat one day claimed to recognize Israel, as I just read out to you, they uncritically believed them and gushed with praise and benefits, not stopping to test his fine words. Now, as a result, he controlled 2 pieces of territory adjacent to Israel and enjoyed international legitimacy with money and arms and diplomatic backing. In retrospect, it astonished to see the credulity of the tough guy Rabin and his successors. 11th point, they didn't enforce the agreements. There was agreement after agreement. 1993 Oslo Accords, 94 Cairo Agreement, 94 Agreement on Gaza and Jericho, 95 Interim Agreement, 97 Hebron Protocol, 98 Y River Memorandum. Lots of fine words, lots of signatures, none were implemented. 11th, and this is a profound one. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin had a favorite phrase that he often repeated using slightly different wording, but it boiled down to this: you don't make peace with friends, you make peace with unsavory enemies. Now, that sounds good, but it's completely wrong. You do not make peace with enemies. You make peace with former enemies, enemies that have been defeated. Resolution nearly always requires that one side in a conflict be defeated and give up its goals. So he was making peace with an enemy, with an active enemy. We did not make peace with Saddam Hussein. We made peace with his successors. We did not make peace with the Nazis. We made peace with successors, and so forth. And finally, a small point, but I think an important one. There was a false parity. As the elected head of a democratic and sovereign government, Yitzhak Rabin erroneously granted diplomatic parity at the Oslo Accords with Yasser Arafat, the leader of an unofficial, dictatorial, and murderous organization. The visual and protocol equivalence that took place on that day, 30 years ago, set the precedent of equating a violent thug with a democratic leader, creating a false equality between the PLO and Israel, and endowing the PLO with the same stature as the State of Israel. This dysfunctional illusion of similarity quickly became assumed, ingrained, unquestioned, and remains the case till today. Rather than the Prime Minister, the Israeli standing next to Arafat at the White House should have been someone like the Second Secretary at the Israeli Embassy in Norway. That would have been more appropriate, but probably would have denied the Nobel Peace Prize to Rabin. It would seem in retrospect that Rabin's vanity got the better of him. So 12 points. In conclusion, Oslo Accords made a bad situation much worse. Quiet hopes to destroy Israel at the start of 1993 transformed into the venomous speech and violent actions later that year, and still evident 3 decades later. Thus did Israel's extravagant mistakes turn a would-be peace process into a war process. However, I have some good news. Looking to the future, I'm happy to report that in my assessment, most of those errors that I just listed to you are not likely to be repeated. I just see 3 of them, which are still a problem. 9 are no longer. One is the reluctance to take casualties, item number 2. Another is item number 3, unelected rulers. Israeli leaders still focus too narrowly on the rulers, ignoring the larger societies, which I think is very important. There's no real effort to address Egyptians, Jordanians, Palestinians, and others, rulers, ruling elites. And finally, this small point at the end, false parity. The equivalence of Israel's prime minister or the PH chairman is still obtained. It's just an unthinking assumption that no one changes. So in all, I have the good news to report that the great majority of errors specifically associated with the Oslo Accords have been adequately learned. In other words, I cannot imagine Israel repeating anything quite like it.
Thank you very much. We do have a number of questions. We're going to try and get through as many as possible. We may not have time for all of them, but we'll start with a question from Carl Goldberg. How do you propose to deal with the fact that the Palestinians are motivated primarily by their religion of Islam, which prohibits peace with the Jews?
In theory, Muslims shouldn't have peace with non-Muslims, Jews, Christians, Buddhists, Hindus, or anyone else. In fact, they do. There are plenty of peace agreements that have held for a long time. And so I don't really see that as a key factor. Yes, Islam is very important, but I don't think Islam requires that Muslims in the modern age go to war with their non-Muslim enemies.
Thank you. The next question is from Andrew Rosemarine. He writes, your father was a great expert on Russian-US relations. What should both their governments do today to improve the chances of a successful Israeli-Palestinian peace process once Mahmoud Abbas steps down? I would add that's less likely than probably the other option of him passing away in office, but the question still stands.
Once Mahmoud Abbas is no more, is there a chance of Russian-American cooperation?
Is there a chance of a successful peace process, I think?
I hate to inform you, but a year and a half ago, there was a Russian invasion of Ukraine that has ended all such cooperation. I can't see it. Before that, yeah, and particularly 20 years ago, yeah, there was considerable possibility of cooperation, but now we're on different sides. And North Korea and Iran are getting tighter and tighter. With Iran goes Hamas. With Hamas goes the Palestinian Authority. No, I don't see a chance of that at this point. But thank you for the compliment about that.
Okay, the next question is from Herbert Lau. Do you think the idea that if Israel will be willing to give the Arabs a state in the West Bank, the Saudis will recognize Israel?
No, I don't think the Saudi calculation is based on a state, Palestinian state in the West Bank. I think it is, that's a small part of a much larger equation, which has to do with their economics, the Iranian threat, relations with the United States, possibility with China, the Russians, and so forth. I can't see that the West Bank looms that large. I would add that I've had the idea, and I've been promoting this, but I think what is important for the Saudis vis-a-vis Israel, not so much the Palestinians, as the Temple Mount, or let us say the Islamic sanctities on the Temple Mount, which now are under control of the Palestinians, with the Jordanians having a side role. I think that Mohammed bin Salman would love to have Islamic control over the Temple Mount. He's already got the 2 big ones, This is the only possibility you'd ever get of a third one. And I think he would pay a good price for it, including diplomatic recognition of Israel. So if I were the Israelis, I would be promoting that. And it is in the air. There are articles assessing that this is something that MBS is interested in, and the Israelis are talking about. So let's hope it follows through.
Thank you. Carrie Hillebrand asks, in consideration that Israel cannot absorb a population of the West Bank and remain a Jewish state, what do you see as an optimum end game for settling the status of the West Bank?
I'm very much against annexation. I think, for the reasons you suggest, that would be a big mistake. The last thing Israel needs is a larger population of Muslims. It's already 1/5. Were to absorb the West Bank, it could go up to 1/3. I don't think that's something the Muslims of the West Bank want, or something the Israelis of Israel want. I think it's a bad idea. It's clearly a long-term solution. I believe I'm writing a book on Israel victory to jump to its conclusion. I believe that the PA and Hamas should be brought down. And I believe there should be an attempt to resurrect new Palestinian institutions in their stead, institutions which are decent and which Israel can work with. And from there, we'll see where it goes.
That actually follows nicely into the next question from J.R. Pride. Are there any elements in Palestine that truly want peace with Israel?
I do believe so, yes. I think there are a lot of Palestinians, some of whom are outspoken, who said enough, we have enough, we want out. Some of them who moved Israel, some of them made positive statements about Israel. I do think this is important. It's not 1967 anymore. And the last 56 years have been a bitter experience. And interestingly, the recent polls show that Gazans are more favorable to coming to terms with Israel than West Bankers. Why? Because Gazans have paid a higher price. So yes, I do think that it's something very much worth exploring. I do think that Israel should be focusing on Palestinians who are open publicly or privately, to working with it. And that this, rather than the use of force, is the way forward.
Thank you. Jeff Billingham asks, hasn't Oslo been in effect cancelled by Palestinian actions? Shouldn't Israel publicly acknowledge this reality and announce Oslo as null and void? Thank you. The question is, hasn't Oslo in effect already been cancelled by Palestinian actions? So shouldn't Israel just publicly acknowledge this reality and announce Oslo as null and void?
It looked like, as Benjamin Netanyahu first came to office as prime minister in 1996, he was going to do precisely that. And of course, he did not. And it's really never come up again. Only has it come up on the Palestinian side. Mahmoud Abbas has many times threatened to end Oslo, whatever that means. The Israelis do not talk about that. The Israeli position is basically that the PA, Palestinian Authority, and Hamas are wretched, but we need them. And we'd rather they be there than not. So however horrible they are, they bring more benefits than drawbacks to Israel. I disagree. I think that's a wrong assessment, but that is the Israeli assessment. I wish they would change that assessment. I wish they would end Oslo, as you're suggesting, but that does not seem to be in the cards. And just in the last day, we have reports, credible reports, the Israeli government, whether it be the prior government or this government, not clear, has permitted not weaponry, but military equipment to go to the PA. That's proof, if any is needed, that the Israeli security establishment, the Israeli government wants a strong PA.
Thank you. We have a question from Michael Cavallo. You state that one error has been dealing with rulers rather than the populace, but Israel can't negotiate with the general population. What can Israel do in practical terms if they want to follow your advice about engaging with the general population?
Good point. Of course, Israel can't engage with the general population, but what it can do is send out messages to the general population. It's not doing it. There's so many examples. The Israelis, to give a non-Palestinian example, provide so many key commodities for Jordan: water and fuel in particular, also protection. The government of Jordan hides this, treats Israel like an embarrassment. The Israelis should be tooting their horn. The same with the Palestinians. They should be making a case for, look at the benefits. There are hundreds of trucks crossing from Israel to Gaza. Does Hamas ever recognize this? No. Do the Israelis ever point this out to the Gazan population? Look, you're getting medicine, water, food, fuel from us. Hey, say thank you. You know, we're doing something for you. They don't bother. They don't bother. The Israelis just don't bother. It's as though they've given up on the Palestinian population or the Jordanian population. They don't bother. So Israeli hasbara tends to be directed towards the larger world. My advice is direct this hasbara towards the Palestinians. That's the source of these terrible calumnies against Israel. That's where it all comes from. I think you have a good chance of making progress. If I'm wrong, it fails, not much is lost, a bit of money. But I think it's very much worth the effort.
Thank you. Roger Gerber asked, how should Israel handle Biden's pressure for concessions to achieve Saudi normalization? Won't Netanyahu want to make concessions to reach Saudi normalization? How does he refuse Biden's dictates?
Well, as I suggested, I think offering control of Islamic sanctities on the Temple Mount would go a long way. And so I'm hoping that that is being offered. In other words, take it away from the Palestinians and Jordanians who've done a terrible job. On the larger question, well, it's going to be interesting to see what the Saudis demand of Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians and what the Israelis are willing to give up. I would say if the PA and Hamas are still there, I hate to say it, but I would say it's worth making some concessions to them, some money and some benefits to them in order to get Saudi recognition. Yeah, I wouldn't give a blank no. How much, under what conditions, all that needs to be negotiated. But I think the prospect of Saudi recognition of Israel is very worthwhile. But let me point out that the anti-Israel, the anti-Zionist calumnies that are so prevalent are not going to be affected by Saudi recognition, as they were not affected by UAE or Sudanese or Bahraini or Moroccan recognition. Those who hate Israel, and Saudi and other state recognition will not fix that. That depends on the Palestinians themselves. That depends on reaching the Palestinians and convincing them that this war against Israel that they've been engaged in for close to a century and a half is not working and should be stopped. They're lost.
Thank you. We have a question from Elaine and Ken Leiter. What is the role of the media in keeping Oslo alive and freezing Israel's actions in taking on the PA and Hamas?
Well, the media, like foreign governments and educational institutions, international organizations, are all bad on this issue. They instinctively take the Palestinian narrative to one extent or another. It's important. The Palestinians have a hinterland that's enormous. It reaches all over the world. I like to point out that the president of Chile and the first minister of Scotland are both highly antagonistic to Israel. They have very little to do with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but they've accepted, they've absorbed the Palestinian narrative. So, yeah, this is a big problem for Israel. But the only way to confront it is not by dealing with every professor and journalist and the like around the world. The only way to deal with it is by dealing with the Palestinians and get the Palestinians to change. If you get the Palestinians to accept Israel, then the rest of the world will follow.
Thank you. And with your permission, I'd like to ask the last question.
Sure.
If you were advising the Israeli government tomorrow, what practical steps would you advise them to take at this stage, 30 years to the day after the Oslo Agreement was signed?
2 points. One, direct your hasbara, your propaganda efforts, your convincing people that Israel is a good place, not towards college students, American college students on TikTok, but towards the Palestinians. That's where the money and the time and the effort should go. They're the ones who really count, and I think they're open to this message. And two, whether by denying funds to the PA or having to take some military action vis-a-vis Hamas, bring down these two execrable institutions and start over again. Do a redo of 1967, this time smarter. Do a mulligan. Let's do it again better. It was done terribly last time.
Okay, thank you very much. We've run out of time, but it was a fascinating presentation and discussion. And Daniel, thank you very much for coming on and giving us your insight and a little bit of the history, and as well as looking forward to what perhaps could happen now the 30th anniversary is over, and we're looking forward. So thank you very much for your time on this. And good afternoon and good evening to all our listeners. And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.